Welcome, everyone. It's good to see people on this nice afternoon. My name is Derek Hefferlin. I am an architect here in St. Louis, and I am an associate professor at the Sandfox School of Design and Visual Arts at WashU, Washington University in St. Louis, where I am the chair of landscape architecture and urban design programs. So that's a mouthful, but more specifically, we're really excited for this event that Gavin Krober, as the instructor of this class last spring in the Sandfox School, and his team are sure to give a great kind of discussion today about the book that they are officially launching. Just a little bit kind of personalizing this. Some of you on this call know that I'm from St. Louis. I grew up here. I won't say what high school I went to, but I did spend the first few years of my life in Baldwin, which is kind of a second ring suburb here in St. Louis. And then through high school, I grew up in what was then known as unincorporated Southwest St. Louis County, now known as Wildwood. It's not that wild, but has a lot of woods out there. And then I lived in the city for a number of years. And now I'm actually, the last 7 years, I've spent kind of at the juncture of Ladue, Olivet, University City, where Del Mar Boulevard ends just west of the inner belt. So the reason I kind of say this, because I think what's interesting about this project that I've been fortunate to be a part of is really kind of this interesting idea of what is the geography of suburbia. And you're going to hear, I think, more about this great little book that you can't really see in my background, but it is here. But first of all, Gavin Krober and I met, I guess now a few years ago, when he located here to St. Louis. And just long story short, after multiple kind of conversations with him and other projects we've worked on together, he approached me about teaching a course on suburbia and what does it mean in our current context. So this class was in the Sandfox School, but more specifically as an elective spring of last year in the architecture program, and also designated as what we call an urban issues elective. So it kind of spanned across multiple disciplines, which was the intention of the class. So the work that came out of it was really amazing, as you'll see in this presentation today. And I just want to say that the relationship has been super strong. The network gets broader and broader, and I'm really excited for the future of this project, hopefully to be continuing in the Sandfox School as we make our way through this pandemic. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it off to Gavin, and he will give more context about the broader scope of the project and the partners.
Great. Thank you, Derek. Let's see. Please let me know if there's any issue with my sound or anything otherwise. I assume everything is audible. All right, well, my name is Gavin Krober. I am the lead organizer for Laboratory for Suburbia. I want to thank you all for being here on this afternoon. Sunny but cold, so maybe it's okay to be inside. Really excited to launch this publication, which we'll get to in just a few seconds, and celebrate the work of 13 students from last spring's seminar. But first, let me set things up with a little bit of context. So Laboratory for Suburbia is an art and design project addressing the political possibilities of American suburbs. A little bit about the partners that make this possible. It is a project of the St. Louis-based art space, The Luminary, and is presented in partnership with The Divided City. Many of you will know that that is an urban humanities initiative at Washington University in St. Louis, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and a joint project of both the Center for the Humanities and the Sam Fox School, College of Architecture and Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Design. Our Divided City grant team includes Derek Hefferlin, who just kindly introduced me, and Patty Hayda at Sam Fox, as well as Isla Sharon in art history. I should also say that we're grateful for the support of PNC Arts Alive, the Crawford Taylor Foundation, and the HKW, that is the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, who have provided support in the early stages of the project. Let me step back to say just a little bit about the ideas that animate Laboratory for Suburbia. In the last decade, Suburbia has emerged as an urgent site of cultural, political, and spatial contestation. Right now, at a conjuncture of pandemic, racial justice uprisings, and the presidential election, Suburbia has become legible as a defining national geography. Despite that fact, the fields of art and design have largely failed to engage this critical space, remaining oriented predominantly toward cosmopolitan destination sites and inner city creative placemaking spaces. So this is a gap in practice that Laboratory for Suburbia is oriented towards. We launched the project last month with an online event called Sprawl Session 1, White Suburbias, which is the first in a series of sprawl sessions we'll be holding, which are public exchanges considering strategies for site-specific art and tactical design project in these really complex 21st century suburban landscapes. Participants for that included myself, the architects Keith Crumwitty and Brian E. Roberts, artists Eric Gottesman, Sarah Paulson, Dred Scott, and Lauren Woods, as well as the historian Walter Johnson. We'll be releasing a video of that event early next month as part of a larger website expansion, and announcing a schedule of further events for the winter and spring early in the new year. The larger project is planned to unfold over the course of the next 2 years, moving through this current phase of discussion and public research towards culmination in the year 2022. And we are currently in the process of exploring publication, exhibition, and public commission outcomes. Now, for today, right, our second public online event, we are here to celebrate the work of 13 students who contributed to this publication coming out of last spring's Laboratory for Suburbia seminar at Sam Fox, the course I led. We have a free PDF copy of this book, and we'll drop a link for that in the chat. If you haven't received it or been able to leaf through it yet, you can maybe do that while you watch. There are also a handful of hard copies available for purchase if you're interested, and there are links for that as well. Salesmanship aside, I can say that this was not originally conceived of as a book. We had originally intended to feature this work as part of a pop-up exhibition last April, but of course the pandemic forced us to adapt our plans, and the students pivoted with a lot of agility toward publication as an alternative. And so it's really exciting to be able to launch this book today. I will leave it to the student editors, Emily Bryan and Jess D'Angelo, to introduce the book more fully. It's worth saying, though, that right now is actually a really good moment to re-engage this work. I don't personally think of this event as a look backward to the spring, but more as a sort of zoom out. Our first event, Sprawl Session 1, with its focus on white suburbias, was very much calibrated to this current conjuncture, again, defined by the pandemic, uprisings, and election, all of which are events that point very insistently towards suburban white spaces, communities, and voter blocks. But these are also events that sort of narrow and overdetermine a conversation about suburbanization. The projects in this book were produced in a very different context. But they were produced by looking at a variety of suburbanization's defining principles and forces and spatial logics, all of which are going to persist well past the current national moment. So today, I do expect us to take some time connecting last spring's work to the current moment, seeing what lenses that work offers us to interpret this conjuncture, and also how we reinterpret that work in light of what's happened in the last 6 months. But I also think we can use the perspectives in the book as a kind of tool as the project looks forward, to step back from the dominant talking points around suburbia right now, to take stock of a diversity of concerns that the project hopes to engage. I think I'll pause the preamble with that and hand things off to Emily and Jess. Just a few housekeeping notes, as I think you all saw coming in from the waiting room. We are recording this, and if you have any hesitations about your likeness potentially being entered into our archives or put up on a YouTube channel later, please do feel free to mute your video. Otherwise, keep your eye on our website, which is laboratoryforsuburbia.site, and our social media feeds. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for announcements about future programs. But with all that said, I will hand things off to Emily Bryan and Jess D'Angelo to take us into the book.
Great, thank you, Gavin, and thank you everybody for coming. I see a lot of folks that I invited, and I just really appreciate everybody showing up. This is, like it says, I'm Emily Bryan. I'm a second-year master's student in art history, so I was actually the only non-architect or art student in this class, which was a really exciting and fun kind of overlap of study and inquiry. But yeah, so I'm going to introduce the projects and go through them very quickly, and then we can come back to them as we discuss. And then Jess will talk about the design of the actual book, which really is the design and layout is really crucial to understanding the projects kind of conceptually, I think. So, so yeah, as Gavin said, the projects were developed out of a very different context just by the fact that we started them in February. So before, you know, pre-COVID and pre everything of the last 6 months. So, but I think as he was pointing to, I think the value of doing this in a class is that the implications for everything that we talked about, we stretch way beyond the boundaries of the classroom and any individual project. So yeah, zooming out and thinking of this as a continuum, not as like looking back at stuff we did 6 months ago. So it's nice to have this event now. So we started the semester doing a lot of reading and then presenting readings to one another about just all manner of the way that the suburbs, both locally and nationally, really developed, going way back, in some cases looking early 20th century sort of demographic moves with the Great Migration up into the Midwest and the Northeast, and up to things like post-World War II Fair Housing Act, and redlining, and then also just architecturally, what did houses in the suburbs of New York City look like, and why did they look that way? So we were really reading a lot about just foundational texts, and of course all of these things have implications for the phenomena we're seeing now. We also read current events or recent events, analyses of events like Michael Brown's killing in Ferguson, which is very germinal to our particular space, but of course has huge national implications. After a lot of time in the classroom and with this reading, Gavin and Maeve both took us on a day-long bus tour of the St. Louis suburbs. So we didn't go to every St. Louis suburb. For those of you who are not from St. Louis, I just want to point out that we have this kind of weird phenomenon in St. Louis where the city is a county and has a government, and then St. Louis County, which is kind of the swath of the area around the city proper, known as St. Louis County. And there's North County, West County, and South County. And then of course our eastern border is the Mississippi River. So the implications of who has jurisdiction over what space is particularly complicated in St. Louis. So we went out and we got to sort of be spatially engaged on this bus tour, although temporarily, because it was only a day. And I think everybody in the class has a different experience of duration in terms of their relationship to St. Louis. So like I've lived here for about 13 years. Some of my classmates are only in St. Louis for graduate school. So that was kind of our range of experience with the space itself. But even having lived here as long as I have, I don't spend a lot of time in the suburbs. So we went to Ferguson, drove through, saw some of the main sites. We drove through some of West County, and we went all the way out to Newtown, St. Charles, and then which is a sort of highly planned community of very new building. And then our instructions or sort of our prompt for the project, which I'm about to show you, was to take something that stuck out to us on this bus tour, combined with our readings, and very loosely speaking, abstract up. So come up with an idea for something that would that was tied to a specific place or sort of a paradigmatic place, and develop an intervention or something that illustrates a phenomenon that we found particularly interesting or striking, and go from there. And yeah, and as you'll see in a moment, the resulting projects took lots of different forms, lots of media used, everything from sort of architectural models to textile work. So with that said, I'll share my screen, and what I'm going to pull up is actually just the PDF of the book, and I'll scroll through, make sure you get to see some of this stuff, and give some manner of explanation without hopefully rambling too much. So if you have the PDF that we've shared, or if anybody has a physical book, I know a couple of people do, you can sort of go through this. But I'll start with, and I'll allude to these sections, but I want to kind of leave the organization with these larger diagrams to Jess's explanation. So I'll just go through the individual projects. So we had Kat and Rachel really seized on some of the phenomena that we think of as being toxic. So these histories of St. Louis in particular, but also suburbs in general, where there are spaces that are in contaminated in some way. So whether we're talking about the specific nuclear legacy of St. Louis and other places, or just the toxicity that comes from building large freeways and then living close to places where there's constant emissions. So Rachel did these really amazing sort of conceptual maps that collapsed a lot of information into one graphic. We have Kat made some collage, for which there's a long sort of art historical precedent of collage and montage here, considering sort of idealistic images of the suburbs with the reality of contamination. Some more of these conceptual maps. And they did some research into health implications, actual statistics on health implications for contaminants. And this was Rachel's idea for kind of delineating some of these spaces that are marked off. And I sort of think of them as, in some ways, crime scene chalk. So she called it chalk it. What if we had like spray painted these streets? It's very stark. And then my project, oh, sorry. And then Kat also did this really interesting sort of embodied experience, thinking about people who are afraid to go outside, but because of this contamination, but being physically active inside in relation to the space, to the actual geographic space in which they live. And again, I'm going fast, and I hope that we can circle back to any of these that anyone wants to talk about in discussion. This is my project, which you can see behind me. I was really struck by the number of spaces that we saw that were marked sometimes with just like a teeny little plaque to represent entire communities of African-American neighborhoods that had been in some way displaced. And I will say each one of these spots, so this is roughly a map, each one of these spots are have their own very involved histories, and I didn't want to collapse them, but I did want to kind of distill and visualize these neighborhoods as places that had been removed at one point were thriving and then were removed through, whether it was explicitly through covenants, unfair housing practices, or very slowly through sort of rezoning issues. And so this was, and I used textiles or textile techniques as a way to think of it as fabric, community fabric. And we had a whole series of projects that really dealt with reconceptualizing space, I think is the simplest way to say it. So proposing ideas for unused space or poorly used space, vacant, abandoned space that we see in the suburbs. So we have Jung Koon's project that proposed growable space in these sort of huge parking lots that we are all familiar with at big box stores. Turning these spaces into community spaces, more living spaces, functional spaces, rather than just these seas of concrete. We have a project by Channel and Yufan who thought about a space that could function in a community. They were thinking of a specific spot that is an abandoned, a vacant lot on Del Mar Boulevard. But I think more broadly, how can you take some of these empty spaces and turn them into activated spaces, literally activated spaces? So you have this kind of wheel where people can exercise, and that exercise then powers some of these interactive sculptures. So a proposition for this particular space. And then John Kuhn, Elise, and Boyan were rethinking big box stores. What if we took these big box stores, and so many people, and this I think particularly came into focus when we were all forced inside and out of stores, when we're moving towards automation and ordering things and having them delivered anyway, what if we collapsed the actual retail space and then reused what was left to be more a more healthy use of space, parks, restaurants, gathering places, and so forth. And then Elise also was thinking of these spaces, parking lots especially, but as spots where a lot of people gather. Could we then use that advantageously? And I love how she kind of really exaggerates the presentation here, to encourage recycling, thinking about access to resources, but then also how do we waste and how could we avoid wasting so much? And aluminum cans in particular is one of the easiest things to recycle. So a collection site in the form of an airplane, which relates to how much aluminum actually gets thrown away every year. And then Channel, Yifan, and Juho really we're thinking about the ways in which highways are thought of as connectors, but are actually, in many cases, when they are built in suburban space, they split up and divide. So it's a very sort of visceral image of a highway as an artery, or as we think of them as arterial motorways, but here we can kind of think of them as really splitting and dividing communities, is that there is a long social history of that. And then Boyan also had an idea for repurposing a neighborhood space in a neighborhood in kind of a high line type installation, where sort of in an effort, I think, to restore some pride of place by considering landmarks in a space, but also repurposing some sort of vacant land. And he did this architectural draw up. And then finally, there were the set of projects that really used humor to kind of draw out some very, what we might consider bizarre social phenomena of suburban space. So Loophole House, which was Jenna and Amanda, where they really dove into these HOA covenants that dictate, what people can do with their own houses that they own, from everything from paint color to lawn decoration, and found all the loopholes, and then built this model that exploits the loopholes in a funny way but that highlights just how kind of controlling some of these covenants can be. Jess and Paul, and hopefully Jess will talk more about this, also did kind of a conceptual what if model of they had fence city and yard city. So whether, and I always think of fence city first in my own mind, but if we all lived in self-contained units where everything we needed was dropped on us, and we were completely divided, never had to interact with our neighbors, versus what if we all shared all of the space and there was no private space around us, and we just shared the resources in that way. And they presented them in these kind of advertising modes of a poster. But I think Fence City in particular, even though they presented this to us first in February or maybe early March, I think Gavin was saying, later on in the middle of lockdown. It felt like we all live in this now. We're all sort of fenced in. So a way in which these projects resonated beyond our critique. And then finally, Paul took the idea of spaces that are abandoned but aren't really abandoned to kind of a funny extreme, suggesting that if you notice that people are using space for something, often unsanctioned, non-establishment activity, build something, build some infrastructure. Let's exploit this opportunity for what it's worth. So those are the projects, and I would say, like, the last thing I'll just say is my part as part of the co-editor was to write an essay. We did have sort of a formal introduction, and I just want to highlight, we were working on this book over the summer as things were rapidly changing. So the essay was something that was evolving the whole time. I wrote it and rewrote it numerous times. It went from sort of a personal diary entry out of frustration into something a little bit more hopefully legible. But as the pandemic was changing, as racial uprisings were happening all over the country, and I really started to think about, but also how, as my own kind of academic career was going, and I was thinking about just a constellation of ideas, I started to think in terms of, think about the virus as poetry, which I say this knowing, feeling self-conscious that there's a poetry professor in the audience, but thinking about the words that we use to describe these huge, earth-shattering phenomena, but also the ways that the virus disrupted our lives and also highlighted already existing social and racial disparity, and access to resources was almost surgical in its sort of ability to highlight and bring out and force conversations about these things. So that was sort of my main role in the book, was writing this essay, which you can all read if you want to at some point with the PDF. And with that, I'm going to hand this back over. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and toss this over to Jess, because she really came up with this design concept of neighborhoods. And I just would love for you to hear more about that from her end.
Can everyone see my screen? Yep. Okay. How do I present this? Sorry. Okay, so I'm just going to take a look at kind of how we organized the book. This is the final, this is the image you'll see on the cover, as well as inside. It's kind of a diagram of how we're moving through these projects and how they were laid out ultimately. But I just wanted to give a little bit of background into kind of our design process and how we're thinking about these. So you can see we have the three neighborhoods, the red, the yellow, and the blue. And as Emily kind of went through and showed you, there's a wide variety of projects, and all the students were thinking about these in very different ways. And we wanted to kind of pull them together in different ways to create a narrative that could be used for both the book as well as maybe an exhibition if that was going to come up. So these are some quick diagrams we did at the beginning. Just taking every project and just really drilling in on both the methods that were used as well as the specific interest and more lines of like the topic that they were interested in. So we felt that there was this duality between what are they investigating and then also how are they investigating that. So we're interested in kind of both sides of that and pulling that together. And so these are two projects that you've seen. Just looking at, are they mapping, are they collaging, are they using imagery, are they using form, and really drilling into that a little bit more, and especially looking into also like tone and atmosphere as well. So these are all mapping projects within the book. But you can see they're doing it in a very various ways. Some are very two-dimensional, some are very three-dimensional, some are actually compressing these layers into kind of one form, and some are extruding them and creating spaces in between. So even though people were doing similar ways of looking at an issue, they produced very different works of art, and we wanted to kind of celebrate the differences between that. So we ultimately came up with these three main neighborhoods, as we're calling them, and they're all focused on a verb. So the first one is exposing, proposing, and then exaggerating. So the exposing neighborhood was looking at some of these hidden or maybe unseen dangers of suburbia. And then we felt like the students were really looking to bring that to the forefront and kind of expose what was hidden. If we move into the proposed neighborhood, we were looking into how students were thinking of creation as a way to add something to suburbia. So looking at these vacant spaces or looking at parking lots, things like that, and having an idea for what they could actually make in terms of a pop-up exhibit or something more permanent. And so proposing that idea for the future. And then the third neighborhood was maybe a little bit more playful or in sometimes more satirical. But the exaggerate neighborhood was looking at maybe one aspect of suburbia, whether it's the facade elements or whether it's one element like a fence, and seeing how if that one thing was focused on so intently, what would that neighborhood look like or what would that house look like? So we divided that up and we kind of show the way of moving through it, and that's how the book's laid out. And then these are kind of like the chapter section. You have the word that is associated with that neighborhood and the definition, and then you move into kind of the diagram. And you can see kind of also these issues that they were looking at are kind of splayed within that neighborhood. So we also wanted to look at, you know, how are they doing this, but also what are they looking at in terms of the idea. And I think that covers it. So that's mainly how we decided to divide up the book. And then if you get the physical copy, you can see that when you kind of page through it, those neighborhoods are shown kind of on the spine. So you can tell what neighborhood you're in based on what color is on that page.
Right. Thank you so much, Jess. I think with that, we should either open it up for questions or head toward, I don't know, Gavin, what do you think? Specific ideas. I guess if there are no questions, we have some things that'd be fun to discuss further, just conversationally, but yeah, I'll kind of open it up.
Seems like a reasonable place to pause for me after a good tour of the book. Is the hand raise function operational? Are we taking questions visually?
I don't think it is, but if people want to drop something into the chat to
Oh.
indicate, or you can just physically raise your hand if your camera's on.
That's a great question from James. Do you find any redeeming qualities in Suburbia? Picking up on notes of critique in the work. Maybe I can put that to you, Emily and Jess, or I mean, some of the other contributing students are here as well. You know, these works were produced, you know, roughly 6 months ago. Some really emerged even further back than that, and of course, there has been a growing focus on suburbia through lenses that are intensely critical since then. And so, yeah, I am interested to know. With that time to sort of meditate on suburbia through the national political lenses we've had, are there any redeeming qualities? You can flip that back at me too, of course.
Yeah, well, and I should say I'm speaking as someone who grew up in suburbia, not of St. Louis, but I mean, I think we certainly discussed it as a negative, or as, maybe not a negative, but as a point of critique. The Dolores Hayden sort of triple dream, this idea that you can get basically everything in one space. You can get green open space, you can get community, you can get your own you know, safety and security. And I think, and this again, this is sort of speaking personally, but I think that you can't really discount the appeal of that to people. And I think the criticism comes in a place where, at least in my mind, in the hidden forces that make that space, that triple dream, accessible only to certain people. And usually in a very, like I said, hidden way. It's not necessarily overt racism that we saw with redlining, but it's still pervasive, and those things kind of still exist. So I think if there's a redeeming quality in suburbia, it's that it's ripe for rethinking some of those things, and being self-conscious and self-aware of the possibility for sort of even redemptive forces in those spaces. So yeah, I think that's kind of how I'm thinking about it now. And I think I have not done a deep dive on the analysis since or during the election, but I think there is some interesting things going on there with the presumptions that particularly certain candidates have about what the suburban makeup is demographically. So that's all I'll say from my own perspective. But
I mean, one thing I could jump on to piggyback there is that for me, the central subject is for me not suburbia or suburbs, this notion of a kind of clearly bounded space, but suburbanization, a process, a historical process, and a set of political forces that have produced suburbs. And that's a process, that has involved very explicit and intentional policies of segregation, which has followed white supremacist logics, which has followed a financialization of real estate and the precaritization of the middle class. But it's not, it doesn't wind up being a judgment on suburbs or suburbia in particular, right? If we are all subject to this historical process, the question is, what you then do within it. If a subdivision is in many ways a kind of spatial product, a series of financial instruments that people happen to live in, it is also, on the other hand, a space that's inhabited, right? And you can use and misuse the building blocks of suburbia, cul-de-sacs, subdivisions, freeways, policy, in different ways. And so suburbia is full of people living in any manner of different ways, sometimes pushing against some of the isolationist or segregationist sort of tendencies that are built into that spatial fabric. There was an amazing book, a few years ago called Big Box Reuse, right? Which looks at like just all of these kind of fascinating ways that, immigrant communities, churches, and others have sort of taken strip mall and big box store architecture and turned it inside out. So I think one question for us in the wider Laboratory for Suburbia project is seeking these sort of spaces of possibility, misuse, play, adaptation, solidarity, and resistance that are possible in these architectures. Yeah. I see Angela's hand up. Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, again, based on what you just said, how do you work against the sort of inherent tendencies of suburbia to isolate people from one another? I'm talking here from Berlin, where people love to be together in public spaces. It's the most communal city I've ever lived in. And people who choose to live in suburbs tend to go to suburbs because they want to be left alone and they want to have a lot of space around them. So I'm wondering if, there's a sort of self-selection process there of people, those who choose to live there choose to do so for the reasons that precisely your interventions are trying to push against their but perhaps I'm wrong again about that, you know, that people really do seek out community in suburbia, but that's my
Mm.
my caricatural notion. Suburban
Um,
space.
It's a great question. Thanks, Angela. I mean, for a lot of reasons, not least because you're putting your finger on what is both a real concern and question, and also like wading into the minefield of caricatures, right? Which any project that is engaging with suburbia, it has to confront this incredibly prevalent, you know, extreme caricature of these spaces, of this sort of persistent image of suburbia as a post-war sitcom suburbia. And of course, there are many, suburbia is not, was never that completely and isn't that now. You know, in a world where we can see immigrant ethnoburbs and, you know, diversifying first-ring suburbs, it's very complex out there. But the question, right, about how you, where you begin, where you build sort of connections, you know, around a public or a community are real. Emily and Jess, I mean, I wonder for you, um, with time to sit with your projects, if you have thoughts about this, because in some ways, your projects, Emily's map, which is visible behind her, and Jess's Fence City, anticipated this current moment with extreme accuracy, right? Emily's map shows a kind of segmentation of St. Louis along color lines, the spatialization of race along to following a set of sort of real estate interests in suburbanization. And as Emily was saying, you know, Fence City really just anticipated the mode of shelter in place, quarantine life that many of us have been living. A few weeks into the the pandemic, I found myself thinking, oh, I live in Jess's rendering now. You know, an Amazon van drove past, and I was like, right, I'm in Fence City, in my neighborhood in St. Louis, an ostensibly urban cosmopolitan room. My question though is, both of those projects, one way or another, delineate some of the most like isolationist tendencies in suburbia or from suburbanization. I wonder, you know, if you were going to try to intervene in those patterns that you were looking so hard at, like in the 6 months since, have you thought about any spaces of opportunity? Have any sort of starting points emerged for you? And the answer, of course, may be no. We're living in an isolationist moment, but I would be curious.
Well, I'll just say, I think the work of Sarah Paulson really resonates with me as someone who has gone deep on in the social history of one tiny like square of the map that I made in Meacham Park, which has a very complex racial history. And yeah, I can't share her work here. I don't have it, but she's a local artist who has deep ties to that community, and I see her work as she really engages with the community forces in that space. It is not just a you know, cookie cutter suburb, even if there are elements of that we, you know, you might see from the highway if you're driving by in that part of Kirkwood. But I think art like hers, projects like hers, are sort of what I am drawn to after having done mine. Something that goes and delves into these complex histories and also engages the community in the process of conceptualizing them going forward. Because like Evan says, like we all may have an image of suburbia, whether we grew up there or not, or it's, you know, like, you know, the sitcom concept of it. But I think one of the most valuable things for me about the class was confronting that's not the varied characteristics of particular suburbs. So I don't know what I would do sort of artistically, or even thinking about you know, analytically as in a research sense, other than just go deeper there's just so much out there. And yeah, I think getting out of the urban, like the city is the only place to be to do anything worthwhile with art and design, is an important prompt going forward for anyone considering these spaces. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure that totally answers the question, but that's kind of how I'm continue to think about it as some of these conversations through Laboratory for Suburbia have been presented to me. So
Yeah, I agree with Emily, and I think this. Oh, sorry, that's my dog. I think this might actually answer both questions of do you find any redeeming qualities in suburbia, and also the idea of isolation, and do people move to the suburbs because they want that isolation? When kind of COVID first started and then moving into the summer, I live in a St. Louis neighborhood where it also has these gates at the end of the neighborhood. And so kind of one side is open, but the other side is closed. And so it has even more of this kind of like fracturing of the neighborhood as its own space. But something interesting that happened was with people not actually going to work and with so much less traffic on the roads, these spaces that were kind of gated in were allowed to become community spaces. So the streets themselves were taken over a lot of times just kind of by the neighborhood children and things like that, but they used it to play hockey in the streets. They used it to play basketball and things like that. And so I saw a lot of opportunity for these kind of suburban connections on like a family to family level that were happening during COVID, because one, people had the time to do it, and then also the streets weren't being as used as frequently. So I do think that there are potential for spaces within suburbia to be kind of repurposed and reused. But I do think that the way it's being used now, with each house, having their fence and it's 6 feet high and you can't see between each other, I think that there should be something that could be done so that people could interact even just on a one house to one house basis, and so that these walls weren't so high. Because I know during the pandemic, like depending on your living kind of situation, your mental health was affected in different ways. So people that had roommates to interact with tended to do a little bit better. And then people that were completely by themselves, I feel like had a really hard time. And so breaking down those barriers, I think would be helpful for societies just in general after the pandemic. And creating visibility between those spaces would be something that I would probably look more into if I was going to do some kind of proposition for the future. But yeah, keeping on that kind of level of what happens from one house to the other, and then how can we increase those interactions or create another space where those interactions could happen.
I see Jenny's hand or finger up, I think. No, I don't. I see John's hand up. John, you're on mute. Or I can probably.
Yep, I wonder if the whole fence or wall idea might actually be more prevalent in the city than in the suburbs.
yeah, I think that's really valid, because when you have houses that are close together, there's almost more of a drive to delineate your space and not necessarily keep your neighbors out, but yeah, just delineate your space and maintain some form of privacy. I think and I don't want to talk for Jess, of course, but I think with our thinking about space in the suburbs is there's more of it, and it's actually the space that serves as the barrier or the boundary, not necessarily a physical barrier or boundary. So and I have to say, like, I think the experience of having been in lockdown, it certainly got me thinking about wanting more space in which to move. If like I can't be in public spaces, if I can't be in communal spaces, I want more private space to feel a little bit less boxed in. So yeah, I think it would be interesting to probe kind of the differences between the barriers we set up in urban spaces versus those we set up in suburban spaces. And I think that the evolution of that over time is also really interesting to consider. even going way, way back to having common grazing land, right, in urban spaces to what we have now with, I live really close to Tower Grove Park, which used to be private property. And, so there's some interesting kind of interplay there, I think. But yeah, it's certainly a valid thing to keep in mind. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that. That's sort of just me thinking out loud, but.
I mean, I think especially in the context of a region like St. Louis, it's always valid to perform these kind of flips between the city and its suburbs. I think of St. Louis City itself as a kind of suburb of its own suburbs. There are very real questions about what kind of governance and agency, a city like this has regionally, when St. Louis County outside of city limits has 3 times the population, when a lot of the elite culture and wealth has been, evacuated outside of city lines. It's very interesting to sort of think these things. And of course, both cities and suburbs are both so complex, you cannot generalize about one or the other. And I think a lot of it comes down to looking at these really particular ways that things are getting bounded or boundaried inside the city versus in the suburbs. One key distinction is often that, while you may have really hard boundaries between different pieces of property in the city, you might also have, 4 families living inside a single unit.
Right.
Really different diversifications of things like that, that in some ways the defining characteristic of a sort of caricatured suburb, as you said, Emily, is not necessarily the fence itself, but actually like the distance between that fence and you, that you have dominion over, versus sharing it. But I don't think we can take, to John's point, I don't think we can take those distinctions for granted, right? If suburbanization is a historical process, there are ways that that suburbanization as a spatial pattern has infiltrated cities. The conversion of neighborhoods like mine, Shaw in South City, from multifamily housing to single family housing would be an example. And there are ways that suburbs are looking more and more like cities. You can see some of this simply in the electoral maps and the sort of suburban urban alliances that have formed along the Democratic side of the electorate.
Well, and it came up in the rhetoric of through the election about, if we think about boundaries, again, not as physical like fences, but as types of housing. The idea that low income or multifamily housing moving into a middle to upper class neighborhood would be, a threat. Trump certainly capitalized on that idea, which I think is in some ways prevalent, and something about urban neighborhoods that have just blended housing, as they say. So that's another sort of version of a fence. The income bracket, the baseline pricing of homes is another kind of fence that you find in the suburbs and in the city, but in sort of different spatial organizations, I think. Dr. Miller, did you have?
Oh,
Yes.
well, I was just thinking that the urban space has changed tremendously in the last 40 years with the neoliberalization of public spaces, where more and more spaces that used to be points of gathering are now privatized or controlled or surveilled in ways that don't that push people out of public spaces and into increasingly private spaces. So it's a moving target in terms of how we're defining cities and suburbs both, because they're both changing.
To that question of definition, I also want to pull Liz Kramer's question out of the chat. In the study of the built environment, what do you think the responsibility of ensuring there is time and space to learn about urban, suburban, and rural spaces now that you've gone through this class and project, right? That there are part of the impulse behind the wider Laboratory for Suburbia project, and likewise behind the class, is to move against a tendency to focus on cosmopolitan prestige sites. Not that there isn't a great deal of fascinating things to work on in those sites and good reasons to be there, but they don't tell the whole story. One of the challenges, right, in a architectural or spatially oriented art history pedagogy that would really parse these different spaces, urban, suburban, rural, would even be distinguishing them, right? That the lines between them are quite blurry. But yeah, I wonder, Emily, Jess, any of the other students that went through, having gone through the class and having enough distance from it to sort of locate it within the wider body of pedagogy, do you see a responsibility to look at these spaces, you know, within like a course of study? Are there, and you know, for me as instructor, you know, are there ways that we could have gone further, certain corners of it that we might have looked at more closely? Thoughts on it as a intervention and redirection within the field? As you've received it.
Yeah, I think in terms of having studio work, I think professors are drawn to kind of the extremes, like the urban density gives a real interest to a project, but also you can have these rural landscapes where you have just like a ton of room to work with, and that could be very interesting. And I think sometimes suburbia is kind of just like right in the middle. And so there's kind of a lack of, I guess, narrative either way. And I think that there is a lot of interest in suburbia, and it is something that I think could be added a little bit more into the curriculum. Right now I'm doing my kind of final degree project, so I am working in kind of a suburban space, and I think a lot of people are. But I think it's one of the first times that a lot of people are working in that space. And so I think it's something that adding it maybe to the beginning of the curriculum would be very helpful. So just giving like a little piece of a rural, a little piece of suburban, a little piece of urban, and kind of what are the different ways you can use that space? And is there something you can do in suburbia that you can't do on either of the other spaces? And I think that would be really interesting coming from a student's perspective.
Well, Emily, Jess, I wonder what you think. I see we are at 5 o'clock. Maybe if there are any further questions, we could take, you know, the last 1 to 3 questions just all in a row, you know, heap them on the table and then transition into a kind of final, more celebratory moment. Are there any last questions that people want to make sure get heard? I think we're at that moment in the arc too, where we can also accept comments, rants. Micah, I see your hand.
I'm gonna try not to do a rant. No, I was thinking about maybe some of my own interests, and I noticed that you did not end up with landscape architecture students this time around, and I'm just kind of curious, like what they might have done. Some of the architecture students did more landscape-like work. And then I was thinking a little bit about McHarg, because Ian McHarg is still like very much held on a pedestal as a kind of like ecological thinker, but was really like trying to like make a profit and build suburbs. And so I think like there's just like not enough like criticism out there of some of these ideas that have been out there for a while in landscape. Like landscape architects have a part in this history. And so maybe it's just like an edge that I hope that students can begin thinking about and engaging as you continue your work.
Any other final questions or comments? Well done. We can transition into the after party. But let's see, to Emily, Jess, let's see, we've got Kat here. I'm trying to see which other students from class have been able to jump into the session, but wherever you are, in the Zoom room or elsewhere, congratulations. thank you for all the hard work, vision, ideas, and for bringing this to light. It's really exciting to see this move out into the world. Cheers to each of you.
Thank you.
Jess, what's the suburban site you're working on? This is where I'm going to try to pretend that this really is just like a party
After
gathering
party.
in the halls of.
Yeah, I'm just working up on the Del Mar loop. So I'm doing a electric scooter charging and repair center. And so it's dealing with a lot of kind of suburban typologies. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. It's one of those spots that, I mean, you're like right on the city line there.
Yeah.
It's a very complicated vision of the suburbs. Because it's also, if you go one block off of Del Mar in any direction, you get like 4 or 5 completely different typologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have my site model and it's just transitioned so quickly between like a very like suburban, houses stacked up and then immediately commercial on Del Mar. And then there's the metro line kind of running right in the middle. So it's bringing a lot of these kind of together. I think it's an interesting site for sure.
Well, I don't know. What else?
Well, I noticed my sister, who is right there, asked, and she's a mental health professional, and asked what I thought was kind of an interesting question of like, because we had Kat and Rachel's project specifically dealt with physical health, what might there be some interesting avenues for inquiry about mental health, particularly, and I just sort of touched on this, thinking about isolation. But yeah, so I don't have an answer, but I think it might be something interesting to consider. I don't know. How do you consider mental health from an architectural perspective or from an art and design? Certainly there's lots of art that deals with mental health in some way or another. But like in a specific space, I'm sort of just thinking that's a really interesting proposition or a set of ideas. And maybe even, as a hopeful art historian, how to think about mental health from an analytical perspective could be, it's interesting, but it's also kind of dicey. Like you don't ever want to boil everything down to mental health, but like what are the implications and effects that can be measured in these spaces?
Well, it's also so difficult with spatial practices like this, right? Because it's easy to slip into a kind of architectural determinism, and you're like, this building will drive you crazy, and that building will benefit you to no end. But this is, of course, not true. There's nothing inherently, about a ranch-style house versus like a project tower, that means it has to operate one way or another. These questions of misuse and redirection and really like how it's used, but also what resources are in place to allow for and support the use of these spaces counts for so much. It's a fine line to walk, because at the same time, of course, our spaces do determine our mentality. I think all of us right now are kind of suffering from a sort of crazy making spatial sensorium. I mean, certainly I am.
Yeah, I think if I could just add color to my question or something, thinking about architecture specifically, when I was a social work student, I partnered with an architecture student on sort of a like, how can we revolutionize the ways that housing projects are created as a way to sort of like facilitate community or like best functioning or best practices, right? So I think that's some of what thinking about the ways that housing projects exist, both in really downtown areas and in suburbia in their own ways. So I think, especially I live in Seattle, housing can be subsidized anywhere here. So you can sort of live anywhere, but be in Section 8. So I think I was thinking about like architecture and the way it informs the way infrastructure then supports flourishing or doesn't support flourishing, which I think you very much spoke to in the way that like we can't be deterministic in architecture, right? Like this will make you crazy or this will solve all your problems. Like that's going to fall apart every time. But yeah, I think those things are what sort of informed some of my
Right.
thoughts.
But it's also absolutely this thing where we also can't slip into some scenario where it's totally about individual agency and choices, right? Where the sort of structural patterns of these things are discounted and set aside. I think it's one of the things that's really fascinating about suburbanization. I thought about this too during Angela's sort of question about starting points and community, right? Suburbanization is really easy to see from a distance when you zoom out on a map and you look at the acreage of different houses and you look at the distribution of different demographics, you look at the flow of populations over time. But close up, as lived, it sort of diffuses into everyday life. No one goes about their day thinking like, here I am participating in the logics of suburbanization. Like they think, I've made it back to my house, right?
Right.
You know, I'm dropping my kids off at school. And yeah, it is this sort of fine line in these things to be able to toggle back and forth between the ground level lived experiences of these places and then the zoom out to the point where you start to see the ways that structures, physical, policy, and otherwise, like condition our life. I think it's like both the challenge of dealing with suburbia as a subject, but also one of the benefits, because because suburbia sprawls, it kind of forces you to continually toggle like that.
Yeah, and I'm just looking at another question from my mom about who feels more isolated than others, and I don't feel equipped to really have that conversation, other than to think about some of the things we discussed with like transportation, for example. Like when you end up with we discussed the phenomenon in class. We discussed the phenomenon of people who find that the only place they can afford to live is in certain neighborhoods of the city, but the only places they can get jobs are out in the suburbs, and then having to navigate those the tension of like, well, how do we get there? And then, you know, either absent or lacking public transportation options, and just how that creates a multi-layered existence of like suburban, urban, and, you know, income brackets that are kind of all over the place, and then and certainly employment and jobs, and just brings in all of these sort of social issues when companies move out to the suburbs. And we see this in St. Louis a lot, right? Whether it's because of tax breaks or whatever, like Clayton, for example, is like another downtown. So you have huge companies out there, and fewer sort of entry level positions maybe in the urban areas. But when you can't live near where you work, that creates another version of another layer of potential isolation, I think. Or I guess that's what your question got me thinking about first. And I think also the pandemic brings up who has who has enough privilege to isolate. Is huge, and that, you know, that's a whole other few hours, so we don't have to go into that, but it certainly plays into how we think about these projects, I think.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful thinking of it that way. That, I mean, it's an almost impossible task when you're dealing with something at the scale of, you know, a suburbanized region, but not to fall victim to the idea of like, you know, that the community exists in city and it's been devastated in the suburbs, but to just kind of always get back to these basics of like, what are the mechanisms by which connection are being produced in different places? It's not whether there's community there or not, but it's about different qualities of it, different infrastructures of community, different accessibility and those things. And in that regard, certain suburbs will be more wildly divergent from each other than they might be from,
Right.
you know, what happens inside the city limits. Well, I want to thank everybody that's asking questions too. When the suburbs are such a fascinating topic, partly because they spark so many different responses and reflexes. And for me, as someone leading a project working on these spaces, it's always really helpful to see what sort of connotations and concerns it sparks. Well, I see a lot of Brian's and Baldwin's on the grid, which might be a sign that like I'm now crashing a family reunion.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, family, for coming.
Well, cool. I'm gonna jump off. Yeah, thank you all for coming. If that Rachel R is the Rachel R, I think it might be congratulations. If it's not,
Yes, thank you, Rachel.
sorry for calling you out. Emily, Jess, thanks a lot for this. This is a belated shout out to Maeve Elder, you know, on the ones
Yes,
and
thank you,
twos.
Maeve.
Yeah, thank you, you guys. It was great presentation, and it's great to hear the run through, even though I'm familiar with the book and projects. It's really great. So.
And thank you, Gavin, for the class and for just like keeping it going as the semester ended and the pandemic took over and everything, and making sure that this all happened and came together. So I appreciate that big time.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you for shepherding it through as well. It is great that we were able to surface this out in the world and make sure that that work stayed part of the project conversation despite tremendous disruptions. And I'm now going to disrupt myself and jump off.
I will
hope
too.
to see you soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you all.